Welcome everyone to another edition of Jeep 411. On this edition, we're with John Currie from RockJock by John Currie. John is going to explain to us some of the new products that RockJock has now, and also explain how some of these products work. We'll also spend a couple minutes going over some existing products that are eventually in the next year or two going to be upgraded and improved. Thanks for joining us and enjoy.
Well, as far as new product goes, RockJock has been working on a few new things we're trying to get done before SEMA this year. So at SEMA, we introduced a few new products. One was what we call a RockNut. And everybody knows what a jam nut is. Basically, it's to lock the rod in to the rod. And we're looking at the way a jam nut works, and basically you're just pulling on the threads. You're not clamping on the threads. So the RockNut is a way we were solving a problem. We wanted something that was symmetric, so when the rod turns, it always looks the same. So with a clamping system, a lot of times where you have a pinch bolt, when you turn your rod, that pinch bolt ends up in a different direction, so it doesn't always stay in the same spot. But we wanted it to work like a pinch bolt, so when you tighten it down, it actually clamps on the thread instead of basically pulling on the thread. And that's what kind of led us to the RockNut. The RockNut is actually made like it's actually got two tapers, and the tapers are slightly different than each other. So when you tighten the RockNut up, it actually clamps down on the threads and pinches the threads on the rod. And that does two things. On a jam nut, if you over-articulate a jam nut, the jam nut will break loose, and now that's loose, so now your threads are actually pushing in and out on each other, and that makes the thread wear out and will actually at some point fail. Well, the RockNut, if you over articulate it, the threads will actually turn inside the nut, but the nut won't loosen, the nut will stay tight. So that's the advantage of the RockNut over a jam nut. It works like it clamps down on the thread, but it always looks symmetric. It looks more like a jam nut. So cosmetically, it's appealing, it's easy to work with, and as we go forward, as we make them in higher quantities, it's going to get cheaper and cheaper to make, and we just think it's kind of be that next thing if you're building a nice set of control arms for your Jeep, the RockNut is going to be like the next Johnny Joint use. It's going to be something you're going to want to use on your Jeep. To go forward on that all started when we were looking at building a long arm for a Jeep. One of the things we wanted to have on our long arm was a different, rod-end locking system, and that's why we developed the RockNut. So we also have a long arm system for the JLs right now. It's actually we have for the JL and the JK. Should be available shortly after the first of the year. The arms are approximately 1 foot longer than stock, and really the reason it was developed like that. When we started looking at the geometry of the suspension, if we go any longer than that, the rear suspension gets too neutral. And what that means is when you apply the throttle, instead of planting the tire in the ground and creating traction, when the suspension gets neutral, all that tire wants to do is spin. So if the arms get longer than what we have, the rear suspension gets too neutral. So we kind of made the arm as long as we could to get as much traction level, compared to like the stock Jeep would have with a shorter arm. We're looking for at the Jeep stock sitting at the stock height, and with the stock arm, that's what traction level we're looking for. So we figured out what that geometry was going to give us, and then when we lift the Jeep and make the arms longer, we want to get back to that traction level. So that was one of the focuses on designing the suspension. The second thing on that was not making the arm so long that it gets into the rocks, so trying to keep that back out of your way. That's always one of the disadvantages of long arms, that the arms are now longer, they get into the rocks earlier. The advantages would be that your tire moves moves up and down in less of an arc, so you're going to get less rear steer out of the vehicle. Your wheelbase isn't changing much as the suspension goes up and down. And then also it moves a little easier. If you've ever driven a Jeep with a short arm that has, let's say, a 4 or 5 inch lift on it, and then driven the same exact Jeep with a long arm, the Jeep with the longer arm has a little plusher ride. The wheel wants to move up and down easier. So it just moves. Basically, you have more leverage on the chassis with the longer arm. So the wheel wants to move up and down easier. So you'll notice on especially on little small bumps, that the ride's just a little bit better with the longer arm. So in my mind, that's the advantages I see to the longer arm, and it's not huge, but it is an advantage, especially like going down to Mexico and stuff like that, where a lot of the roads you're going down, they're not big bumps, they're just little like shutter bumps. That longer arm is going to give you a nicer ride. And cosmetically, I think a lot of people buy a long arm because they want to be able to see that longer arm. It looks more like a race car. Cosmetically, it's appealing. You could see what you spent your money on, and that's a big thing to the consumer. They want to see what they're spending the money on, and that was one of the reasons for the long arm. And the cosmetic part was one of the reasons we actually made the arms. They're 70-75 T6 aluminum. It's 2 inches in diameter. Went back and engraved the arm with the RockJock logo on it, and actually had them clear anodized, so they always look that way. A lot of guys will make aluminum arm, but they don't plate them. So after a while, they kind of get tarnished looking, or they'll stain from the salts on the road or whatever. So our arms we're putting a clear anodize on them, so they stay nice. And then articulation wise, and the big advantage in articulation is the spring, and the shock and all that combined. And because the wheel is moving more straight up and down instead of in a bigger arc, it actually will articulate better and keep that wheel planted. And if you do a lot of off-roading where you're turning through like big bumps, with a shorter arm, you'll get what you call rear steer. As one wheel goes up and the other one goes down, they basically, one arm's getting longer, the other one's getting shorter, so it actually turns the axle in the car. Well, when you turn the axle in the car, it wants to steer the rear of the vehicle. Sometimes it helps you, sometimes it works against you, but depending on the obstacle. But the longer arm, you just have less of that. With the longer arm, your radius is a lot bigger. So as the arms go up and down, they stay closer to the same length. So that's the biggest advantage to the long arm over the short arm. So another new product we introduced at SEMA this year was our forged chromoly steel arms for the AntoRock. So we made those for the TJ, the JK, and the JL. So our most popular arms are up now, they're forged chromoly steel. And one reason for that, we're looking at our quantities of arms that we're manufacturing. Those arms were laser cut and welded together and then powder coated. And we looked at, hey, if we make this arm out of chromoly, it's not only going to be stronger, we could actually put some ribbing in it. It'll be lighter, and it was just an advantage to us, and cosmetically appealing. So we not only got a lighter arm, we got a stronger arm, and it's more cosmetically appealing. So as far as the cost-wise, it was very similar for us to have it forged as it was for fabricating. The trick is the numbers. That's one advantage we have, maybe over some competitors that are coming into this now. They're seeing what we've been doing for years, and they're trying to copy our product. Well, they're starting out, they can't afford to go out and have stuff forged because of the amount of volume of stuff that we're selling. We could look at other forms of manufacturing now and actually offer the customer something that's actually nicer and better for not any more money. So another thing that we're doing this year, actually on our sway bars as well, is starting in 2020, is the sway bars will be powder coated. So all the sway bars will come powder coated. It was something that it would come up. Usually the sway bar is put into a place where you can't see it, so it didn't matter if it was coated or anything. If it rusted, it really didn't matter. But now on some of the newer Jeeps, the sway bar is more visible, so we started powder coating all the sway bars in a semi-gloss black. For those of you, if you've never Jeeped with an AntoRock sway bar, back in the day, everybody would take all their sway bars off. Well, on a leaf spring Jeep, that worked fine. Your leaf spring doesn't have a lot of travel. Maybe a good leaf spring maybe have 7 or 8 inches of wheel travel. When the TJ came out, you're dealing with a coil spring Jeep. Well, a coil spring Jeep is going to have maybe 10 inches plus travel, or it could have 10 inches plus. Well, we noticed on the TJs, when you disconnect the sway bar, the Jeep became almost it was very hard to drive. It was unstable. If you tried to drive around the street, you go around a corner, it actually lift a tire off the ground. It had a lot of body roll to it. So what we were trying to basically get to is we want something that when I lift one front tire 6 inches, that the rear tire should go down 6 inches. So we're trying to get a balance between the front and the rear of the Jeep, and that's where the AntoRock came along. The front sway bar is actually lighter, and then to try to balance it with the rear, so everything worked together. Instead of having either no sway bar in the front, and then what would happen, your front suspension would start doing everything, or you'd get so much body roll, the Jeep was almost scary to drive. So you're trying to get a balance between, hey, I want this thing to work good off-road, and I want it to work good on-road, or at least, drivable on-road. Something without sway bars wasn't even drivable on-road. It was almost dangerous to drive it on-road. So the AntoRock is a lighter bar. It allows everything to move together, still has a good, stable feel on the street. When you hit the dirt, you never have to disconnect it, and you're not really losing very minimal amount of wheel travel. If you disconnect your sway bars and connect them, and you might lose maybe an inch overall measuring it, but that is actually still there, and you're able to achieve that travel depending on how the Jeep is the traction level of the Jeep is pulling itself. It'll actually pull the wheels into the wheel wells even further. So the static, when you measure it statically, you might be able to measure a slight difference, but off-road, all that travel is still there. Yeah, one of our newest AntoRock sway bars is for the JT. The front of a JT is pretty much exactly like a JL. So our JL sway bar works on the front. The rear is completely different. A lot of people were saying the rear of a JT is like a 1500 Dodge pickup. Well, it's similar, but it's not exactly the same. So we went back and first designed one. It worked okay. Found out, hey, depending what wheel they ran on the back, we were having some issues with the clearance on the sway bar. And then we went back and redesigned it a second time and came up with some new parts for the JT rear sway bar, which is a little bit different than a lot of our sway bars. The mounting bracket is pretty unique. It has a offset arm to let the arm travel all the way up in the wheel well to get all the travel we can out of the arm, and came out actually really, really nice. So that was another new product we actually had at SEMA this year. Although it wasn't in the new products show, I believe there was about 4 Jeeps that were in the show, or JTs that were in the show, that had our rear AntoRock sway bar on it. And that's going to be available right around the first of the year, right after the first of the year, I believe.